Today on the Writing Coach podcast, I have Cassandra Lane. Cassandra, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I'm excited to be here.
So I read that when you were about 11 years old, you said to your mother, I want to be a writer, but I want to be behind the scenes. I'm curious, where did that desire to be a writer come from, but also why behind the scenes?
Yeah, so I think writing was because I loved reading so much. And I think I fell in love with reading, watching my mother read first. She worked so hard. She would come home and just hole up in her room with her romance novels and just her experience of being it just felt like she was somewhere else and the way her body moved while she was reading. I was fascinated by the vision of her reading. And it's just, as a child, as children, we do what our parents do. And so at first I started kind of sneaking into her romance novels until I found my own authors. I remember, loving Judy Blume, Nancy Drew, and I just loved being in those worlds. I was a very timid child. I'm the oldest of five, so I had lots of kids around, lots of cousins, but I was kind of a loner. I liked to daydream. And I think those two things, loving reading and being very timid, drew me to writing. I felt seen when I read books that spoke to me, and I fell in love with that and wanted to create that for readers myself.
Well, parenthood is obviously a topic that you're very interested in on a number of levels. Both the magazine you edit, LAPerron, as well as your new novel it's touching on these themes. It's interesting. This show is called The Writing Coach, but perhaps for so many of us, our first writing coaches are really our parents reading to us.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I remember reading to my son when he was still in utero. My husband and I both did. And he loves language. He doesn't read as much as I'd like for him to right now. He just turned 14 and he's done a lot of other things, but we have to start early. And I thank my mom for giving me that exposure. She didn't necessarily read to us at night, but just again, watching what she was doing and wanting to mimic that had its impression.
Well, speaking of childhood, you've said, I grew up poor in the South, but rich in experience. Can you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, I grew up in an intergenerational household. It was at one point when my great grandmother was still living, my great grandmother, who was in her 90s, my grandparents, and this is on the maternal side, my grandparents, Papa and Grandmama, my mother's parents, and my mother and her children. And her children, there's a 17-year difference between myself and my youngest brother. So I kind of look at that as five generations because he's totally not, Gen X. And they tease me about being so old. So that in and of itself was very rich, being exposed to, the cultures and the history of my grandparents and my great grandmother. My mother is a musician. She plays the electric guitar, gospel. And so we would have church services and prayer meetings in the home. And there was always, some jam session with the musicians. The land itself was very rich. Despite our financial struggles, there was always food on the property, fig trees and peaches and plums, and it was just written. The garden that my mother started. There was the woods behind our house. So, you could let the imagination roam wild. So those are things that maybe I didn't appreciate as much as a child, and especially as a teenager wanting to be away from that small town. But I definitely look back on those experiences and see how they've influenced me as a person, as a writer. And they were very rich experiences that are still fertile in my imagination.
I think for a lot of families growing up with maybe a lot of siblings or not a lot of wealth, university isn't always on the radar. At what point did you decide that was the path you were going to take? Was that you were always headed to school? Oh, yeah.
I think so. And I was the first in I had one cousin who had been an older cousin who had been, but other than that, there were no other examples. So I applied, not knowing what to do. I applied to the school that he had gone to, and only one application. Remember filling out that financial aid application, which was a monster in and of itself. But yeah, I just saw it as a ticket out. hopefully out of poverty. I loved to learn. I loved to read, to study. I knew that I wanted to be a writer. I didn't have any examples of that, but I thought I'll choose journalism. And sure enough, he was a photojournalist. So I had some, example of that. And I said, I don't want to be a photojournalist, but I want to be a print journalist. And that's what I did. I got into that school. I majored in print journalism with an English minor, became later the editor of the campus newspaper, did an internship at the local newspaper, and the rest was history. It was just the kind of vision that I had for myself. My mom was like, how are you going to be a journalist? You don't talk to people. You're so afraid. But it worked out, because when you're a journalist, you're listening. And I had honed such strong listening skills by taking in and observing all the people around me who were much more, just more out there. And so I think as a journalist, people want to tell their stories, and they saw that I was interested in them. And I had a fun time in my 20s working as a journalist.
Well, you made it sound like a simple process. Oh, and then I was editor-in-chief. But in fact, it's my understanding you were the first woman editor-in-chief of that paper. You were the first Black editor-in-chief of that paper. What was that experience like? Did you encounter challenges, or, tell me about that experience of being not just the first Black editor, but the first woman editor as well?
Right, absolutely. I think the first challenge was within. I remember a professor that I got close to. She was a journalism professor, and she loved my writing, and she would invite us out to lunch. We went over to her house. She was the one who first put that seed in my ear. You should apply for the editor-in-chief position. And I was like, I could see myself doing freelance writing or being a staff reporter, but the editor, I wasn't necessarily interested in that, or thought that I was ready for that, which again goes back to self-worth, self-value, things that I needed to work on then and years later. But she pushed me. I remember her pushing me to go and apply. I had to sit before the board and go through this interview with all these adults. It was very intimidating, but they did hire me, and it was a great experience. I think it was from my junior to the second half of the junior year and all of senior year. I lost a lot of sleep. We had a sofa in the newsroom, so a lot of sleepless nights and just falling asleep for a couple of hours on the sofa. Because, we were handling a full schedule, especially that senior year. And then trying to put out the newspaper, which was, it was a lot, working with back then the Apple, Adobe. And then I had a campus job. Again, my family was struggling, and so I needed to work. So I had a campus job, actually two, and I worked off campus as well. So at one point I was kind of navigating all these little part-time jobs. I worked at a radio station. I worked at the front desk in my dorm, and I was the editor-in-chief of this newspaper, and I was a full-time student. So it was first, the struggle was just internal self-worth, and then trying to do it all.
I edited and wrote for a magazine while in university as well. And that was one of my first experiences editing other writers. Yeah. And I remember coming in pretty heavy-handed and editing stuff pretty harshly, and then getting these people who so hurt. And that was really, these days, all I do is work with writers. But I'm glad I had those experiences early on editing people, and to understand how to do it in a way that empowers them and makes them feel proud of their writing, as opposed to perhaps the hack and slash technique I started editing with. So was it the same for you? Tell me a bit about this experience of first working with other writers, not just writing yourself.
Yeah, well, the internship helped me. And I think my personality is more, let's work on this together as a partnership. So really, I loved my writers. They seemed to love me, the photographers and designers as well. So it was really, it felt very collaborative to me from my memory. I don't remember necessarily slashing stories, but just sitting down and saying, how can we make this better? Here's some examples. And I had that internship experience where there were some really great editors and there were some not so great editors. And I wanted to be more like the editors that's kind of just my personality, more diplomatic. And so maybe I was probably not as strong, when I needed to kind of bring down the hammer as I needed to be, because I err on the diplomatic side. And I did a lot of some rewriting, but I think the writers felt more nurtured and saw, oh, this story came to life in this way. And they still had their bylines, which they were excited about. So that's how I remember it.
Well, not to jump too far ahead in your narrative, but I believe you worked in journalism. But tell me about this group you ended up as a part of in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was working at the newspaper, the daily newspaper in New Orleans called the Times-Picayune, which is now bought out by the Advocate. And, it was great. I was learning so much on my different beats and working with so many editors, but I still wasn't fulfilled completely. Because remember, when I was a child, I wanted to write books. I wanted to write creatively. And so I, of course, hit certain walls in the newsroom. I wasn't necessarily covering what I wanted to cover. I wanted to go deeper and spend, much longer time on research and stories. And that's just not where I was on the ladder. And I came across this Black creative writing group called Nomo Literary Society. And it didn't stand for anything, but it was all caps and a kind of, it was kind of tongue in cheek, no more that literary BS. Let's get in here, let's do the work. It was founded and led by poet Kalamu Yasalam. And we met on Tuesday nights, and I would jump out of my, newsroom, get there kind of late because I was depending on what I was covering. And I think the workshop started at 6 p.m. and they would go to midnight and later. So it was just really no nonsense. It was filled with lots of poets, spoken word artists, people writing novels, everything. Another journalist. And it was just so much richness from their dress and speech to their work. I loved hearing the poets, read their work out loud. That musicality, I know it seeped into me. And Kalamu, the founder, he forced us to get out into the community and read our work at bookstores, at the Tennessee Williams Festival. So it just was really affirming to me and gave me that creative outlook that I craved, the cultural, community that I craved, and eventually helped embolden me to lead the newsroom full time.
And where did you go from there?
Well, I crafted a freelance writing career still, so that's what paid my bills. It was a huge pay cut, but I was married at the time, and my husband was very supportive. He's a photojournalist, and we were fine. And then eventually we decided that we wanted to move. We loved New Orleans, but we wanted to move on professionally. Kind of felt like we had gone as far as we could go. And I started looking at MFA programs, and that's how we ended out here in Los Angeles. He came to work for the Associated Press as a photojournalist, and I went back to school to major in creative writing.
So as someone who already had an education in journalism and then a ton of experience working in journalism, and then rubbed shoulders with all these poets and novelists and other artists, what were you looking for from an MFA, and what did you take away from that program?
I was looking for time, first of all. Not having a lot of money, but I had saved a lot. Cost of living, we had a decent salary, and cost of living was really low. And, I didn't buy designer anything. So I saved a lot knowing that we were going to make this move. And so while I was in the program, I didn't work full time. I worked part-time at one point at a bookstore, and did some tutoring, a little bit of freelance, some travel writing, but for the most part, I was able to really focus on my manuscript for those 2 years and on learning, working with my professors, meeting other writers from all over, from all walks of life. It was a low residency program. And I just wanted to really hone my chops, do a lot of reading, do a lot of writing and workshopping. And it was some of the best 2 years of my life. It was wonderful. And I'm still in touch 20 years later. This is the 20-year anniversary, actually, with so many of those writers.
So the manuscript you mentioned you were working on in school then, is that the manuscript that eventually grew into your book?
Yes. So many iterations, but yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to get into the book. It's We Are Bridges. Mm-hmm. But first, I want to hear a little bit, because selfishly, I'm a parent of 3 daughters. and a writer, but I don't feel like those cross paths at all, because I feel like I'm the last person who should give parenting advice. I feel like I don't know what I'm doing half the time.
So you never write about parenting or anything with your kids?
I write help, what should I do?
That's about right too.
But in all seriousness, I'd love to hear a bit about LAPerron magazine, how you got into that magazine, and you're now the co-editor in chief.
The editor-in-chief.
Editor-in-chief. No, it's yours. So tell me all about your magazine.
That's okay. That's brand new. So I started in 2017, and it's funny, I've kind of moved around in different careers, but they all have that thread of writing and editing in some way. And I was at the Dodgers, which was kind of my oddball career. I was at the Dodgers from 2016 to middle of 2017. And
this is the baseball team.
The Los Angeles Dodgers, yeah.
Yeah. I'm from Canada. It's like, if it's not a hockey team, I'm like, wait, which sport is that?
Who is that? Oh, they would just scream if they heard that. So it was a great experience, but very demanding. I was working sometimes 6-7 days a week. And when I found out about this opening, at the time I was managing editor, I jumped, even though I was going to take a big pay cut at the time. I jumped at it because I just was looking forward to going back into writing, and editing full time. I loved, as a parent, I loved what they did. I had used the magazine when my son was younger. I had also met one of the publishers in a previous job, the one that I had before the Dodgers, and we really hit it off, partnering on some things. I was working for an early childhood nonprofit as a senior writer. And she, of course, was always looking for stories, and we met to talk about education and covering education. So when I found out about the position, I reached out to her, and she told me to apply. I did. I went through all the interviews, and I was hired that summer, 2017, as managing editor. And I worked under the then editor-in-chief, who'd been there off and on like 20 years. So just knew that magazine in and out. She'd been there far longer than the publishers who bought it about 7 years ago. So it's been an amazing experience. I was named editor-in-chief this January.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So it's a lot. We're doing a lot. And, of course, that happened, the pivot that we all had to do during the pandemic. So we were already digital. We have a digital magazine, but we've been forced to expand, in those realms. And because we didn't print for about a year because of the pandemic. So really letting people know, hey, we're still here. We're still here to provide you with information. We were talking to experts, medical, et cetera, just to try to get parents the information that they needed. And also, entertainment and joy and ideas on how to keep the kids entertained while you're all at home. We were jumping on Instagram Live more, which is something that we hadn't done much of. We just started a podcast. So on the podcast, we're interviewing all kinds of people in the community, from celebrities, like we had Debbie Allen on, the actress, dancer, and we've had radio show hosts on. So they're all parents, and they're bringing their own unique perspectives to parenting to our audience.
So you've got your magazine, you've got years in all different aspects of working in writing and publishing, but all the while in the background, there was a memoir churning. Tell the listeners about your award-winning book, We Are Bridges.
Oh, thank you. Yes, here it is.
Yeah, hold it. We're on video here, so hold that up.
Oh, got all my notes here. So this is We Are Bridges. And, it's been a labor of love. It is a book that I started once I left LA, or Louisiana, the other LA, and moved to the big LA. And it was my first time moving away from my home state. And I didn't have any blood relatives out here. And I think that caused me to look back on the past in a different way, and with deeper appreciation, and also with curiosity. I was looking at doing a lot of self-work, therapy, looking at some of the issues that I had around romance and marriage and race, and wanted to understand that in a larger context. And part that was, understanding where my family came from. So many Black Americans can't trace their lineage. And as far back as we could trace were my great grandparents. And the story was that my great grandfather was lynched in 1904. And my great grandmother, the love of his life, and he was still the love of her life when she was in her 90s and on her deathbed, because she was still crying about him and how much she loved him. She had one child, and that child was for him. She did remarry. They moved from Mississippi to Louisiana, and that's how we all ended up in Louisiana. But I wanted to know more about that story and the impact of that kind of racial trauma on not just that family, but on the ensuing generations, on me. I at one point said I was never going to become a parent. I associated, parenting with so much heaviness and burden. And so there was a lot of fear around that. So again, as I was doing that work, that self-work, I just started asking all of these questions. And since there wasn't much on him in terms of records, I wanted to create a story for Bert. His name is Bert Bridges, thus the title, We Are Bridges. I wanted to create a story that humanized him. And so there are parts of the book that are fictionalized. And then when I did change my mind and become a parent, so the book looks at my great grandmother during her pregnancy, the love that they had, of course, the lynching, as well as my contemporary story of becoming a mother. And it goes back in time, weaving those two stories together.
And I know intergenerational trauma is one of the topics addressed in the book. Could you speak a bit to that topic? But also I'm curious, is it a healing process investigating and writing about these things? Or is it just more painful knowing more, right? It's a big question and a very difficult topic, but...
Yeah, that's a very important question, because no, it was very painful. Lots of tears, just a lot of pain in writing it. But for me, I'm drawn to what's dark and heavy in terms of my creative work and psychological work. So that's something for me that, while it might not feel good, it feels necessary. It's just how I love to laugh. I love to go out. I love to dance. All of that is part of me, but I'm also very much drawn to, secrets and trauma, and why did this happen? Why did this happen to this man? And why did great grandma Mary, not want to talk about it? And what did that silence do to the family? And I was thinking also about more modern, traumas within the family, and done to the family in terms of racism. And look at what's happening, today in the 21st century. So I wanted to look at all of those connecting dots. And I just feel like, even though it's painful, if we continue to avoid it, that's not helping in any way. So for me, the healing is in at least trying to understand. There's, if not complete healing, there's some satisfaction in that for me. I wanted to have something. I just wasn't satisfied with knowing in my just mental capacity, my mental space, that this had happened. A lot of my cousins didn't know about this story. I wanted to get it down on paper. That's the most substantial, I could make it, given the lack of records. Although I did hire a researcher who believes she found the same Bert Bridges on a US Census report. It doesn't make it in the scope of this book. That's something that I'll continue to work on, and have written some on that. But yeah, for me, at least this is something that humanizes them, that acknowledges why we are the way we are, perhaps, and makes all of those different connections.
When was the book released?
In April of this year.
Just this year, right?
Yes.
So how was that, doing, obviously in the middle of a pandemic, a book launch?
Yeah, well, I had seen last year several friends, have to do a book launch when it was all still so new, and we're all like just still in shock. And so I had watched with compassion and as much support as I could, and sharing out their books and posting about their books. And So I had a year, or all of us authors this year had a year to kind of watch that process. I saw also how creative people were given the restrictions. And so I was, inspired by that. And so by the time I finished book production and editing, revising, and started talking to the marketing and publicity department, I had some ideas on, who I would want to be in conversation with, what bookstores or institutions we would want to partner with for virtual events, maybe, broaching the subject of some quote unquote hybrid events. So it was fun putting it together. It's been a lot of work and I'm still doing some things around it. But yeah, April and May and early June too, were packed with virtual events and interviews and so it's been fun. I think the reach might have been greater in some ways because, everybody can jump on a Zoom. Not that we're not sort of fatigued from being online. But it's been great seeing the names and faces of people who wouldn't have been able to show up at an in-person event.
As a writing coach, I primarily work with fiction authors, and something I'm often working with them is this idea that the book is not you. This is a work of art you're putting out into the world. I don't work with I've never worked with any memoirists, well, a little bit, but I'm curious. In your case, the book is you. It's your memoir. It's your family. So what kind of how do you stay connected to that, but also disconnect from it in a way that's healthy and doesn't define your entire self-worth on a book you've written?
Oh, I love that. I think I had some early, experience with that because I started writing about myself a little bit and family a little bit when I was in my 20s and at the newspaper. At the first newspaper where I had my full-time job, they gave me a biweekly column. And I wrote, of course, about the community and things happening, but there were moments where I wrote personal columns. And I love the personal essay. So that I had practice. People would write, letters about what I was writing. I got letters from so many different people, prisoners as well, telling me their stories. And I loved how by my sharing my story, it would open up, this avenue to hear other people's stories. And that's what I also loved about reading personal essays. So by the time, this came out, all these years later, I've had some experience with publishing personal pieces. Of course, it wasn't a whole book, but I was able, I think by the time I write a piece and I revise and revise and revise, there's some emotional distance already. And I by studying writing, studying fiction, poetry, the I, or third person, whoever it is, I'm able to craft and separate that emotional self from the person that's crafted on the page. That doesn't mean that family has done that, but me as a writer, I'm able to do that. So there are things in this book that I did that I write about that I did that I'm definitely not proud of, but again, I'm able to see myself as a character. I'm able to see myself as a fallible human being and to craft it in a way that I hope connects with other people. Most of the feedback from family has been positive, but there was at least one that was not. And so I've had to grapple with that, the fact that this person is upset. And it's 2 or 3 lines that are not specific. I intentionally worked to revise that and to pull out any identifying characteristics, but it's a reference to the fact that there was incest in the family and she really was upset and enraged by that. So just because I've done that work doesn't mean that, other people are not going to take it personal. And I understand that. That's a risk.
Yeah, it certainly obviously applies to memoir, but I think if you create anything and put it out into the world, especially these days, you're going to piss someone off.
Absolutely. So, even if it's fiction, they're just sure that you're talking about them. So yeah, you can't win everything. And I understand and accept that.
Can you tell me a bit about the award that the book won? Was that validating? What was that experience like? It's certainly exciting, I imagine.
That was so exciting. I remember I was at the magazine at LAPerron in the office. This was before the pandemic. So it was the end of 2019. And I had sent off, I was still revising, and I had sent off the manuscript to this contest and just forgot about it. It was just one of those things, and kept working on it. And I got, I think in September of 2019, an email that I was a finalist, one of 5 finalists. I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then in December, I got the call from the publisher that I was the winner. And yeah, I wanted to scream much louder than I could because I was at work. It was very affirming. It was very exciting. It was emotional. I remember my mom was the first person I called, and she cried, and she's like, this has been your dream for so long, and I'm so happy for you. And then I cried, and yeah, it was so great to be connected to the woman who's still alive, Louise Meriwether, who's 96, I believe, an author, an activist, Black woman who, you know, who wrote novels, children's books, fought for civil rights. So this award is named in her honor, and to be connected to that legacy is invaluable to me, and I feel so honored and humbled by that.
Beautiful. Well, the book is We Are Bridges. We're going to post on the show notes for this episode all the links to your website as well as to the bookstores where folks can pick up their copy. Anything else we want to let the listeners know about the book or what you have upcoming?
Oh, you know, I've had all of the links to my launch events are on my website. So if someone wants to listen to a recorded interview or reading, a lot of that is on the website, cassandralane.net. And, you know, I'll be doing some library interviews, Q&As, just still out there talking about the book because it's hopefully going to live beyond that launch.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I know our listeners will do what they can to get some copies purchased and give it a read because I know they're going to find it a worthwhile experience.
Thank you, Kevin.
Cassandra, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.